Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to The Global Current. I'm Adeline Pedersen.
And I'm Zanele Njapa.
Today in news, South America's trading bloc, Mercosur, votes to revoke Venezuela's membership.
A left-leaning independent candidate wins Austria's contentious presidential election.
And a recent report indicates that parts of Antarctica's ice shelf is melting.
In analysis, Italy's prime minister resigns following a failed constitutional referendum.
And the future of US-Sino relations under the upcoming Trump administration.
Then, an interview with Dr. Benjamin Goldfrank of Seton University regarding the impact of Fidel Castro's death in Cuba.
And now, Joseph Orico reports on Venezuela's removal from Mercosur.
On Friday, December 2nd, Venezuela received a notice that they were being removed from the South American trading bloc known as Mercosur due to the failure to comply with the trading bylaws and democratic principles. Founded in 1991, Mercosur is a trade union for South American countries. Venezuela was only recently brought into this union in 2012. On top of his nation's removal from Mercosur, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro now faces rising political tensions, food shortages, and economic strife. According to the Wall Street Journal, Venezuela may be able to later negotiate its standing within the South American trading bloc. President Maduro claims that Venezuela's removal from the trading bloc violates the Mercosur's bylaws. Maduro also accuses Brazil and Argentina of blocking Venezuela from acting as the leader of Mercosur, citing September of this year as an example. The Pan Am Post reports that the removal of Venezuela from Mercosur was an agreement between Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Uruguay in response to Venezuela's failure to ratify the trading bloc's laws and legislation. Members of Mercosur feel that having Venezuela in the trading bloc's union is counterproductive. It is hard to get a trade deal when you have a member who is against trade. Without Venezuela, Mercosur is much better, as a senior Brazilian diplomat states. If Venezuela wants to re-enter the trading bloc, they will have to negotiate on the terms of Mercosur. In the meantime, Venezuela is suspended from the South America trading bloc for an indefinite period of time. This is Joseph Rico reporting for the Global Current.
Up next, Priya Bave brings us a report on Austria's recent presidential election.
According to CNN, Austria's far-right presidential candidate Norbert Hofer has admitted defeat in the presidential election after exit polls showed an apparent win for his left-leaning rival Alexander Van der Bellen. Despite the mostly ceremonial role of the Austrian presidential office, the world has looked on at the Austrian election results as a possible anti-establishment rebuttal to the recent election of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump and Britain's vote in June to leave the European Union. Official results have not yet been announced, but exit polls from state broadcaster ORF show that Van der Bellen with 53.6% of the vote.
I think it is a historic day for Austria, a red, white, red signal of hope and change. A red, white, red signal today goes from Austria to all the capitals of the European Union. I will try to be an open-minded, a liberal-minded, and first of all, a pro-European federal president of the Republic of Austria.
Despite the leftist party claiming a victory, Mr. Hofer's National Austrian Freedom Party, or the FPÖ, remains a formidable force in Austrian politics. His 46.7% was the best national result to date for the FPÖ. The party's leader, Heinz Christian Strache, said, "Our time is coming." Even opinion polls before Sunday's vote had suggested a tighter margin between the two rivals. BBC reported on the election campaign, which was bitter as well. The candidates traded insults and some election posters were defaced. Surprisingly, Mr. Hofer conceded within minutes of the first projections in this rerun. He thanked his supporters and described himself as infinitely sad that it hadn't worked out, according to ABC News. CNN reports that his plans for the time after the election include kicking back, relaxing with my wife, and reading The Old Man in the Sea. In a statement to BBC, he calls on Austrians to work together, regardless of how we cast our ballots. ABC reports that the European Union leaders welcome Mr. Van der Bellen's victory, which comes amid a majority challenge to established parties in much of Europe. European Council President Donald Tusk conveyed wholehearted congratulations, while Germany's Social Democrat Vice-Chancellor Sigmar Gabriel called the result a very clear victory for reason against right-wing populism. French President François Hollande released a statement thanking Austria for choosing Europe and openness. France, the Netherlands, and Germany all face elections next year in which anti-mainstream and anti-immigration policies are gaining ground. The significance of the upcoming elections remains to be unseen, but Austria at least remains marginally left-leaning. This is Priya Bhavi reporting for the Global Current.
Next this morning, Ian Fauché reports on recent findings which indicate the shrinking of Antarctica's ice shelf.
The Motherboard reports that scientists have recently discovered newly melted parts of Antarctica. The polar continent's landmass has been spared from rising global temperatures until now. Despite the consistent collapse of ice in the northern Arctic, Antarctica's ice shelf remained steady and even grew. This year, however, climatologists recorded ice melting and receding in both the northern and southern poles, according to the U.S. National Snow and Ice Data Center in Colorado. The facility observed that the Arctic and the Antarctic had collectively lost 3.8 million square kilometers of ice since the 1981 to 2010 average ice cover was measured, a mass large enough to cover Texas 4.5 times over. Antarctica alone lost approximately 2 million square kilometers, according to the U.S. National Snow and Ice Data Center. The facility also notes, however, that Antarctica could potentially gain 0.4% of its ice mass back per decade from specific parts of the ice continent refreezing. The Arctic shrunk 2.3 million square kilometers in that same time and is set to diminish by 5% every decade. This does not bode well for inhabitants of cities with low sea levels, as increased ice melting yields higher water levels. With cities such as Miami and Annapolis already combating sea flooding during high tides, many coastal cities may have to establish seawalls and drainage systems. A 2014 report from the Union of Concerned Scientists states that dozens of coastal cities, including the United States capital of Washington, D.C., will be affected by seawater levels by 2045. For the Global Current, this is Ian Fauché.
Next up, Alexander Prostramo analyzes the effects that Italy's failed constitutional referendum may have across Europe.
On Sunday, December 4th, the Italian population gathered to vote on a referendum which would potentially reform the country's constitution. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi advocated for the reduction of power of the upper house of the Italian parliament by cutting its seats from 315 to 100. According to the Prime Minister, the goal of this parliament reform was to simplify the administration of the country in order to revive the nation's economy. However, the reform would shift regional power into the hands of the ruling party. The Italian population voted against the reform mainly for political reasons. Elly Schlein, an Italian member of the European Parliament, stated that this vote was transformed into a vote against the Prime Minister and his government rather than a vote to reform the constitution. But what will be the impact of this referendum on the Europe as a whole? To better understand the results of the referendum, Renzi must be analyzed individually. The Prime Minister has strong support from global leaders, such as President Obama, who invited him to a press conference in late October, clearly showing the world that he supported the Prime Minister's views on the European Union. Obama stated,
"It's a strategic interest of ours that we have a successful, united Europe." I think Matteo embodies a new generation of leadership, not just for Italy, but also for Europe.
Italy's vote will have a deep impact on the European Union, as Renzi was the only premier left with a positive vision for the future of the European Union. In fact, populist movements have been receiving tremendous support on the European political stage, a trend confirmed by the Italian vote. With Renzi's defeat, the populist Five-Star Movement, which has become one of Italy's most popular parties since its 2009 foundation, will gain more support. The leader of the populist movement was in fact campaigning against the reform on Renzi. He appears in strong opposition of the Eurozone and recently launched a campaign to hold a referendum on the Euro. Also, many political leaders with similar views rejoiced about the results of the Italian vote. The head of the French National Front, Marine Le Pen, tweeted, "Italians have disavowed the EU and Renzi. We need to listen to this thirst for nations' freedom and protection." On the other hand, German Chancellor Angela Merkel took the note with regret and stated that Germany will work closely with the next Italian government. Demands for new elections are now rising, especially since Italy has experienced 3 unelected governments since 2011. The President of the Republic, Sergio Mattarella, will decide if an election should be held or if a technocratic caretaker government should take place. Despite the confusion it will experience in the upcoming weeks, Italy is still the 3rd largest economy in the Eurozone. However, it has been experiencing a growing deficit and is only second to Greece as the European country with the largest debt. Therefore, the euro status is currently threatened due to the financial and political instability that is evident on the European stage. Governments, academics, and individuals will follow the development of the situation in these difficult and unstable times for all members of the European community. This is Alexandra Prosnell for The Global Current.
And now, Vincent Maresca analyzes the future of relations between the United States and China.
On December 2nd, 2016, United States President-elect Donald Trump received a phone call from Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. According to NBC News, the controversial call broke decades of U.S. protocol and raised concerns that a Trump presidency might reverse the U.S. One China policy. Trump defended the conversation in a series of tweets. The first one stating that the Taiwanese president called him to congratulate him on winning the presidency was posted immediately after the conversation ended. In his second tweet, Trump sarcastically downplayed the backlash against the call, saying, quote, "How does the U.S. sells Taiwan billions of dollars of military equipment, but I should not accept a congratulatory call," unquote. In 2 late tweets on Sunday, December 4th, the president-elect accused China of falsely maintaining a low currency and initiating a military buildup in the South China Sea. Therefore, is there any justification for reopening diplomatic relations with Taiwan? And how does it affect relations with Beijing? The call quickly provoked Chinese diplomats and experts. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called President Tsai's call, quote, "a pretty move," unquote, and filed a complaint to the U.S. urging America to, quote, "deal with the Taiwan issue in a prudent, proper manner," unquote. Professor Wang Dong at the School of International Studies at Peking University called it, quote, "a wake-up call for Beijing," unquote, and sees China as bracing for a pretty rocky 6 months or year in the China-U.S. relationship. On the other hand, Professor Shi Yin Hong at Renmin University thinks that Beijing will probably pursue, quote, "a wait-and-see attitude," unquote, despite the call. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was stark criticism on the phone conversation. In an interview with CNN News, former Ambassador Christopher Hill said that the phone call is unprecedented and denounced the upcoming administration's willingness to change policy regardless of any outcome.
Well, obviously, he should not have. We have had for 40 years rather clear policies of how to implement the One China policy. 8 years during the Reagan administration, this never happened. 4 years during the Bush Senior administration, this never happened. 8 years of Clinton, 8 years of George W. Bush, and 8 years of Obama. So this is a real break. Obviously, it was an example of what is all too often happening now with this incoming administration, this tendency to wing it. What I'm concerned about is that rather than acknowledge a mistake, they will double down on it, say that this is indeed an effort to change some of the terms of our One China policy.
Ned Price, a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, reiterated the United States' unwavering commitment to a One China policy. The Democratic Committee also reacted against the phone conversation, calling it, quote, "a threat to national security," unquote. Despite the criticism, Trump received praise from his inner circle. During interviews on ABC News and NBC News, Vice President-elect Mike Pence defended the congratulatory call of the Taiwanese president, labeling her as, quote, democratically elected, unquote. When asked if the phone conversation jeopardizes US-Sino relations, he said,
"This was a courtesy call. The democratically elected president of Taiwan called to congratulate the president-elect. And I honestly think that what world leaders are finding, those that have reached out to the president-elect, those that I've talked to several dozen world leaders. I spoke to King Abdullah just yesterday, and I think there is a great sense of enthusiasm and optimism around the world because they're encountering in President-elect Donald Trump a strong leader with broad shoulders who's going to advance America's interest, but he's also going to be engaging the world on behalf of America."
When he was asked if there would be a policy change, Pence said that policy will be discussed after the presidential inauguration. The single question that now remains, why Taiwan is vital for U.S. interests, and who and what is behind these negotiations. Historically, the U.S. sided with Taiwan since the 1970s when it agreed to give the island nation $12 billion worth of munitions for defense purposes. Thus, because of China's military escalation in the South China Sea, a Trump administration might be compelled to engage in a containment strategy. Furthermore, the people and entities surrounding the president-elect are some of the staunchest opponents of the communistic legacy in China. Robert Dole, a former presidential nominee and a World War II veteran, lobbied long before Trump's victory for a conversation with the Taiwanese. PBS NewsHour reported that Taiwan's state news agency mentioned Edwin Follner, founder of the conservative think tank Heritage Foundation, as a crucial figure. As a member of President-elect's Trump transition team, Follner is in a unique position to influence the direction of the new administration. Further, the Follner-founded Heritage Foundation is known for its Reagan conservatism and criticism of China's communist past and its human rights record. Despite mass speculation, the foreign policy outcomes of this call in relation to Taiwan and to China will remain unknown until Donald Trump becomes the 45th President of the United States of America on January 20th. This is Vincent Maresca reporting for the Global Current.
Finally this morning, Daniel Kim brings us an interview with Dr. Benjamin Goldfrank to discuss the death of Cuba's former leader, Fidel Castro.
Hello, this is Daniel Kim, reporting for Global Currents. Today I'm here with Dr. Benjamin Goldfrank, and thank you again, Dr. Goldfrank, for taking time out of your schedule for an interview. And so now, to begin with the recent death of Castro, it's like, how important was his role during his later years after his rule in Cuba?
So he stepped down from power in 2008, and Raul stepped in. So he was no longer the head of the country, and Raul Castro took on all power. And his role after that, there's a little bit of question about how much he influenced Raul, in the sense that he may have slowed down or tried to prevent some of the reforms that Raul wanted to make from happening. So some of his economic reforms, in terms of increasing some of the private sector activities, small business activities. I've seen some accounts that say that Fidel tried to slow those down or prevent them from happening as quickly or as deeply as Raul Castro wanted them to happen. So there's a possibility that with Fidel Castro's death, Raul Castro will move a little bit more quickly to implement some of the reforms that he wanted to do. Like initially he had talked about cutting the state sector jobs and increasing the number of private sector jobs.
Okay.
So that's a possibility.
Okay, so then what would this mean for, I guess, Cuba and then the rest of the world? It's like, yeah.
So Cuba's economic situation is not so good right now. Their economic growth is very low. They've been relying on Venezuela for energy imports, and Venezuela's economy is doing poorly, and it's cutting the amount of oil that it sends to Cuba. So Cuba needs new investment and new sources to try to jumpstart their economy. So potentially these kinds of reforms to increase the private sector could be helpful in Cuba right now. For the world, that would mean potentially that Cuba loses its sort of symbolism as the last outpost of communism.
Right. So going back in history, Fidel Castro and the United States obviously didn't get weren't really that much of friends, but if the United States had pursued other course of actions in, I guess, trying to convince Castro to denounce communism, what would you think would have been a better strategies besides Bay of Pigs and economic embargoes?
Right. So the United States had supported the dictator Fulgencio Batista during the period of the leading up to the Cuban Revolution. So towards the very end of 1958, the U.S. decided to stop supporting Batista as fully, but they never really threw their support behind Fidel Castro and the M26 movement, guerrilla movement that he led. But once he took power and wanted to nationalize certain industries that the United States had major investments in, including hotels and casinos and the sugar industry, the U.S. didn't take kindly to those nationalization drives and could have had a different approach at that point. I mean, there's a pretty strong case to be made that by reacting so negatively to Castro's nationalist impulses, anti-imperialist impulses, the U.S. sort of pushed Castro into the arms of the Soviet Union, and he may have not turned towards Soviet communism if the U.S. had had a different response to him.
All right. So going back to today, after his death, do you think there's any possibility for future relation or discussion among the two countries, the U.S. and Cuba?
Well, I think the election of Donald Trump changes things more than the death of Fidel Castro, right? So Castro was not super happy about the détente between his brother Raul and Obama, and so if Donald Trump hadn't won the election, my guess is that the new opening relationship between Cuba and the United States would continue and would have led to greater stronger relations. With the election of Donald Trump, however, it's really uncertain what's going to happen because Donald Trump has, in the past, as a businessman, tried to do some business deals in Cuba, potentially in violation of the embargo. And then later, he campaigned in favor of a harder line against Cuba. And he's now said that, if he's going to try to negotiate a better deal with Cuba, and if they don't give in on certain issues, he will undo the deal that Obama did.
All right. So Castro, he's one of the most significant figures, arguably, like compared with Gandhi and then Martin Luther King and then all those other past figures.
Except that those figures are pacifists.
Right.
So I wouldn't put him right next to those two. Definitely in Latin America, he's a huge figure.
Right.
One of the biggest figures of the 20th century, if not the biggest figure of the 20th century in Latin America.
But then, why do you think there's so much controversy, surrounding Castro? It's like there's one group that supports him and hails him as a hero, and then while the other group just sees him as the enemy of their people for some reason.
Well, so when Castro took power, he did make changes on the island of Cuba, which led to many people's businesses being taken away from them, and many people fled Cuba, right, including a lot of Cuban Americans, who today are now Cuban American, who came in right in the aftermath of the revolution, and then a couple years after that as well. So there's massive emigration from Cuba, and there's continued to be emigration from Cuba over the years. So a lot of the people who left Cuba are opposed to the communist ideology. They're also opposed to the lack of freedom of speech, lack of freedom of association, inability to elect their leaders. So, it is a one-party state. There's not freedom to do things that we take for granted in the United States. So, for many people, and they also, after the revolution, they did execute a lot of people who had worked with the Batista dictatorship. There were political prisoners over the years. There were poor treatment of people with AIDS. So there are a lot of critiques of Castro's rule.
Right. So
and for reasonable reasons.
Right. And so now for the final question, with Castro's death, is the world better off or worse off, or it doesn't matter?
The sort of the anti-imperialist forces around the world have lost their biggest figure, right? He was a hero to those who viewed colonialism and Western and U.S. imperialism as a major destabilizing and force for the worse in the world, and so they've lost this hero. In terms of sort of practical terms of whether this will affect global economy or the politics of individual countries, I don't think it will have a huge practical effect. Sort of symbolically, it has a bad effect on those who believe in anti-imperialism. Although he was sick for many years, so this was a long time coming, it's not as shocking.
Right. All right. So thank you again, Dr. Benjamin Goldfrank, for your time. And this is Daniel Kim reporting for Global Currents.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Adeline Patterson.
And I am Zane Linjap.
Same time,
same place,
next week.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Liam Scollins, our associate producer is Morgan Mount, our news editor is John Trudeau, our analysis editor is Marissa Hutton, and our technical producer is Trevor West. This week's interview segment was produced by Daniel Kim. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on WSOU 89.5 FM, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.